Good morning, and thank you very much to the organisers of IATEFL for inviting me to be here. And I'm glad to be here because a month ago I had a heart attack. And I am here today on my first entry out into the world of By the time I finish, you'll probably wish I'd had that. What I want to do today is, as the title says, is look at two old perspectives, old approaches to language teaching and language learning, and bring a new perspective to bear upon them. Both of them are approaches which have had a great number of adherents, and they're also approaches that have had a great number of critics. Both of them are still very much alive as approaches, and I want to bring to bear some evidence from corpus linguistics that might help us recognise the importance of what these two approaches are saying. So it's the implications of a corpus linguistic theory for learning the English language, and actually the Chinese language too. If there are any Chinese in the audience, this is going to have a tiny bit of Chinese in it as well. So, key works in Michael Lewis's work, the lexical approach. I'm just putting them there to point out the fact that Michael Lewis's key work, the lexical approach, is now actually 20 years old, just over 20 years old. But there's still work going on. Hanna Kraszewska and Leo Sullivan have a joint issue of humanising language teaching, which came out only a few months ago. And in between times, there have been a range of things going on. It's not gone away, but it is actually now an old approach, still very much alive. According to Michael, the successful language learner is someone who can recognise, understand and produce lexical phrases as ready-made chunks. He argues very strongly that the idea of learning the grammar and then slotting the words in simply will not work in a world in which the language doesn't function like that. So the emphasis has to be on teaching the vocabulary in context rather than learning vocabulary in lists, on the one hand, and certainly not focusing on the grammatical structures, focusing instead on the words that can actually be used to communicate. What he argues is that when people pick up vocabulary in their context, they pick up the grammar quite naturally. There's no need to teach the grammar specifically. And the second approach that I'm going to mention in a moment argues exactly the same. And he argues that when people learn grammar separately, they don't actually pick up much useful vocabulary. I'm at the current moment learning Chinese. I can actually do a few things in Chinese. I can write a speech in Chinese, but I can't engage in casual conversation. Now, why is that? Well, it's because the language teaching materials I'm learning from in Chinese enable me to say such things as, "My father drinks tea in the back kitchen," which, believe it or not, is actually one of the sentences in the language teaching material that I've learned, but doesn't yet enable me to say, "Could I have a beer, please?" On the whole, given that my dad's been dead for quite a few years, my need to talk about his tea drinking habits has not been all that frequent. Whereas, of course, my need to have a beer is pretty well every single hour of the day. So, what we need to recognise is indeed that learning the grammar and then illustrating it with vocabulary won't do anything useful for us. But on the other hand, if you learn the vocabulary that's relevant to your needs, then of course the grammar comes along. That's the argument Michael Lewis makes. He has, however, been criticised. Gary referred to my Wikipedia entry. There's also a Wikipedia entry on Michael Lewis's work. And if you look there are criticisms made, and there are criticisms made in the literature as well, that he's ignored how language is learned. There's a criticism made that there's no theoretical underpinning, and there's a criticism made that he trivialises the role of grammar. There's also not a criticism that I've seen written or heard, but which could be made, which is that all the discussion of the lexical approach has been in terms of Indo-European languages. So is it limited to that particular group of languages? The second approach, old approach I want to look at is Stephen Krashen. I don't think I know any applied linguist who can provoke such extremes of reaction. I had a PhD student once who was shocked I was saying nice things about Stephen Krashen. There was a kind of reaction of a kind that was visceral rather than simply logical. But, like Michael Lewis, very much alive. He calls it, or it's often referred to as the monitor model. That seems to be quite the wrong label for it. It's sometimes also referred to as the input hypothesis, which is better, except that I think the word hypothesis is no longer really an adequate word. What it should be referred to is as the input theory, but actually it's not. And I'm going to carry on referring to it as the monitor model, because that's what people tend to do. But it's not really a very clever label for it. Again, you'll notice, very even older approach than Michael's. The first key work was written in 1982, which means it's now 30 years old. And then there's much more recent work, of course, in 2004, and subsequently I could have added other things there. According to Stephen, the crucial requirement I'm telling you things you know, of course, but the crucial requirement for successful language learning is comprehensible input. And the only way to acquire a language, as opposed to learn it, is by reading and listening to naturally occurring spoken and written material that is slightly above the level that the learner's arrived at. Well, that's a subconscious process, and it doesn't connect directly to the process of conscious learning, which is where the monitor comes in. You can learn about the language, and that's a different process. And I suppose with my Chinese language learning, I'm halfway between the two. I can actually write the Chinese, but I don't actually have the skill to speak it, because my monitoring, I know more about the language than I do of the language. Again, Stephen Krashen has been open to very similar criticisms to Michael's work. He's been criticised for ignoring how language is learned. He's been criticised for having no linguistic underpinning. If you look at the Principles book, it is very much about the processes of the language learning processes, not a lot about the linguistics itself. And again, he's been accused of trivialising grammar. And it's open to criticism for trivialising the role of the teacher, although he does go quite out of his way to say that teachers still have an important role to play. Now, what I want to do in this paper is argue three things. First of all, I want to argue that both Michael Lewis and Stephen Krashen are actually entirely compatible with reliable psycholinguistic evidence. In other words, they don't in any way ignore the ways language are learned. There's ample evidence about the way language is stored that will enable us to feel confident in what they're saying. Secondly, I want to argue that both of them are supported by at least one carefully worked out linguistic theory, which is mine. You may feel that puts both Michael Lewis and Stephen Krashen on very shaky ground. But never mind. There is at least one theory that will do it. And thirdly, the characteristics of the lexical approach and the monitor model the characteristics that both theories, both approaches assign to the language learning process, I'm going to argue are actually equally true of a non-Indo-European language, which is Chinese. I'm just going to spend a few minutes on that. I assure you I shan't start speaking in Chinese, because if there are any Chinese people in the audience, they wouldn't understand me. Okay, so how do we learn language? Well, there's been two key psycholinguistic traditions. One of the interesting things about psycholinguistics is that actually almost all the psycholinguistics that linguists talk about have been done by people who are really linguists pretending to be psychologists, instead of being done by psychologists pretending to be linguists. And I'm interested in the second group, psychologists who are doing language work. And when you look at this work, you get some interesting findings. And there's two particular areas of work into what's called semantic priming, and they work into what's called repetition priming. And here I must acknowledge thanks to Michael Pace-Sigg, a PhD student of mine, who's just published a book which contains a significant chapter on all the literature that has been written about these two kinds of priming by psycholinguists. And he knows much more about it than I do, and I've learnt from him. So semantic priming first. Essentially, in semantic priming, informants get shown something, typically a word, sometimes it's an image, and that's called the prime. And then they get shown something else, which is always a word, or actually almost always a word, it can actually be an image, but normally a word, and they have to say it. That's all they have to do. And they're wired up, and the length of time it takes them to articulate the second word is measured. And what's found is that when that's done, if some words that are shown first seem to slow up the recognition and articulation of the second word, and other words speed it up. So, if you have the word wing, and then you're shown the word director, this is my made-up example, but these are the kind of examples that the literature deals with. If you have the word wing, and then you see the word director, it won't alter the speed with which you say the word director. It won't affect it at all. If, however, the next word is dog, it will very, very infinitesimally slow up the speed with which you say the word dog. However, if you show the word swan, it will infinitesimally speed up your ability to recognize the word swan. Or, milk will not have any effect on your ability to recognize the word available, one way or the other, won't slow it up or speed it up. But if you see the word horse, it will slow it up. But if you see the word cow, it will speed it up. Interestingly, if we'd substituted the word beef for milk there, then we might actually now associate it with horse. Which, of course, actually, making a more serious point, shows that we're talking about linguistic knowledge, linguistic experience, not world knowledge. There's a lot of work there. I'm not going to talk about it because it would be tedious, but you'll notice the earliest semantic priming work was done in 1971! Even I was young in those days. And it's still being talked about, but not as a controversy. This is not disputed work. There are disputes how to interpret it. That is, there is. But the actual fact is not disputed. What's the significance of this to the language learner? Well, first of all, it shows that words are actually closely linked to each other in the listener's mind. And it seems to show that words that are closely linked can be recognised more quickly together. So it just, in a sense, encourages fluency. It doesn't fit in at all with the idea of grammatical frames and words that slot in. So all that kind of linguistics that has its origin before Chomsky even, but actually has it, perhaps it's epitomised by Chomsky, which when you generate a grammatical structure and you slot in words, which has in different ways fed into the more grammatically organised of our language teaching materials. That notion, the idea of learning the grammar separately from the vocabulary, simply isn't supported by this. Words connect to each other, they link to each other. It does, however, fit in very well with Michael Lewis's lexical approach. He doesn't refer to that literature, no reason why he should have done, but that literature does fully support him in the claims he makes. Let's now look at repetition priming. Repetition priming is a bit like semantic priming, but it's actually even more important. And this is, if you say two words together, and then at a later point, and it can be as much as a day or so later, you say the first of those words, it will speed up the recognition, the ability to utter the second word. So, putting together a pair of words which I imagine you haven't heard before, scarlet onion. If you encounter that phrase, scarlet onion, and then a day or so later are shown the word scarlet, it will speed up your ability to recognise the word onion. Now, the explanation has to be, there's no other one that's possible here, it has to be that you're remembering the combination from the first time. It can't be the case that you'll have encountered scarlet onion enough times in your life, if ever, that you've got a record of it as a ready-made pairing. So you must be remembering that single instance of co-occurrence. Again, it's old work. And again, it's not disputed by the psycholinguistic community. It starts in 1981, and it carries on. I've given you papers only up to 1984, but the papers right up to the present day. No one is fighting it. Again, there's arguments about how you explain it, what's going on inside the mind, but not the phenomenon. Now, repetition priming both explains semantic priming, because it explains why that pair of words, why one word would accelerate the other, but it also explains collocation. And if a listener or reader encounters words in combination and then stores them as a combination, then of course it would explain why the ability of one of the words to trigger recognition of the other can occur, and it also explains why collocation would start to build up. After you've done it a few times, you recognise that combination. So, what's the significance of the language learner? Well, first of all, we've got proof that the listener encounters, when we encounter words in combination, we link them in our minds without there being any conscious learning. Notice that, without there being any conscious learning. That doesn't fit in well with the idea that words are stored in grammatical structures, slotted in there, but it does, on the other hand, fit in well with Stephen Krashen's argument. The acquisition versus learning. So, answer to the first question, lexical approach and Krashen's monitor model are wholly compatible with the best psycholinguistic research, that done by psychologists. So let's now move to the second one, the linguistic theory. So that one's definitely supported. Let's move on. Okay. First of all, there are many problems with existing theories of language. First of all, fluency is harder to explain than creativity. Secondly, there's no single language, in fact. One of the most terrible things is to assume there's a thing called the English language, or the Chinese language, or the French language. There are lots of varying languages. I don't speak the language of the doctor. When the doctor says to me, "You've got a cardiac infarction," I think, great, that's better than a heart attack. It's his or her language, it's not my language. Likewise, though, when I talk about colligation to my doctor, he does think I'm ill. The point is that we actually have lots of overlapping languages, and indeed they overlap, of course, regionally, they overlap socially, they overlap culturally, and they overlap in terms of genre, style, domain. They overlap creates tension. My wife is a pretty literate woman, she's the classicist, and she said to my son-in-law, who is French, so we excuse him. She said to him, and I was sat there, and he told her off for not saying I was sitting there, on the grounds that sitting was grammatical and sat wasn't. What we're actually looking at are two variants of the language, and one of them was French, and the other was my wife's. But the point is that it's wrong to think of a single monolithic language. Thirdly, one of the most interesting questions, actually, but one I don't often see talked about, when we hear or read a word which has got multiple meanings, and that's a lot of words in the language, in fact most of them, we know which meaning is meant, pretty well always. So how? And finally, one of the things that John Sinclair discovered when he was working on the Cobble Dictionary is that collocation is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. There are virtually no words in the language, probably are no words in the language, which don't have some collocations. But grammars treat them as trivial. So any account of collocation has got to be central to how language actually functions. So the lexical climbing theory is something that's grown out of my work with John Sinclair and with corpus linguistics. It also grew out, as I shall show in a few minutes, out of my work as a discourse analyst, which I was before I became a corpus linguist. And that is, the lexical climbing theory basically is a psycholinguistic theory based on corpus linguistic evidence. And it claims that whenever we encounter a word, or it can be a group of words, or it can be a part of a word, whenever we encounter one, we subconsciously note the words it occurs with, the collocations. That's the first and most important. So, for example, hard, you've got all sorts of possible words. You've got worked hard, tried hard, fought hard, die hard, found it hard, prayed hard, raining hard, squeezed hard, or hard to believe, hard to understand, hard to imagine, hard to explain, hard to follow, hard to hear, hard to remember, hard to bear, which is probably what you're thinking at the moment. Hard luck, hard line, hard facts, hard evidence, hard lives, hard water, hard labour, hard winter, hard currency. All of those collocates are part of collocation, part of that combination that Michael Lewis is talking about. Or to take a more subtle example, word collocates with against. It also collocates in that phrase with and or your. So we get a word against or your word against mine. And if we take that then becomes available for co-occurrence with something else. So a word against as a whole phrase here not being a technical expression, just a cluster, group of words, a word against is primed for most of us to co-occur with sending or receiving information. So won't hear a word against, won't say a word against. Or another example, ears collocates with eyes, and that eyes and ears becomes itself a group that will collocate with something like ACTAS. So the Bank of China, which acts, and this is the original example, it's a modern example too, the Bank of China, which acts as Peking's eyes and ears among Hong Kong's banking community, but acts as someone's eyes and ears. So they nest, once you've got a collocation, that collocation itself can collocate with something else. A brilliant quote from Jimmy Hill in the edited collection that Michael Lewis put together, Teaching Collocation, is this: one of the main reasons the learner finds listening or reading difficult is not because of the density of new words, but the density of unrecognized collocations. Now, I learn that all the time. You know, I'm learning Chinese, as I said. You'll come by the end, you'll believe I'm learning Chinese. But how, which I shall talk about later, which means good, occurs in all sorts of constructions, and some of them have very little to do with goodness. And so I'm constantly encountering words, but don't know what they mean. There's a line that Jeremy Irons uses in the film Moonlighting, where he says, I understand what they say, but I don't know what they mean. And I feel that all the time with my Chinese. I understand the characters, but I don't know what they mean, because I don't recognize the collocations. But secondly, importantly, we go beyond collocation. Whenever we encounter a word, or a syllable, or a combination of syllables, we note subconsciously the meanings with which it's associated. So, for example, word, and I've said word collocates with against and and it has a semantic association, I've already referred to it, with sending and receiving. That's a semantic association. It is collocations as well, it does have collocates, but crucially, it's a semantic set that it connects with. And I mentioned ears collocating with eyes. That's a special case of co-occurrence. It co-occurs with lots of other parts of the body. Ears and nose and throat, ears and eyes, ears and hands, ears and nostrils. All of these come from my corpus, of course. And then squashy fingers and crinkly ears, swollen ankles and painful ears, buck teeth and cauliflower ears, bulbous nose and big ears, long tail and pointed ears. Apart from the last, they all describe me. But the point is, all of this is part of that semantic association. The word ears likes to co-occur with body parts. And there's even some more there. Close the ears and close the eyes and put the ears to work, and so on and so forth. Biting our nails and covering our ears. It has a semantic association with parts of the body. 23% of all instances of ears in my corpus co-occur with another part of the body. The third one is pragmatics. We notice the pragmatics in which the word or phrase or part of the word is occurring. Consequences, for example, I said in my book, Lexical Priming, consequences tend to be negative. The grim consequence, a bleak consequence. Results tend to be positive. A great result! As a Liverpool supporter, you can imagine I'm saying that a lot these days. The perfect result, a fine result, and so on. It's 3-to-1, positive to negative result, is 9-to-1 negative to positive to consequence. And again, with that phrase, that notice now the quick combination, denial goes with denial. Send and receive a word against, like hear a word against, has a pragmatic association with denying. You're far, far more likely to say you don't do it. I won't hear a word against. I won't say a word against. And then with hypotheticality. So all that the kind of wouldn't hear a word against is an example, so he wasn't prepared to say a word against. All of which, of course, come from my data. We also note subconsciously, and this is very important, the grammatical patterns a word or a syllable or combination of words occurs with, the colligation. So consequences tend to be indefinite. Another consequence, one consequence was, a consequence of this was, our results on the other hand to be definite. This result, the result. And reason and result tend not to be possessed. The reason was that, the result was, but reasons in the plural and results in the plural can be. My reasons were, our results showed. So these are the colligations. There's no logical reason for this. They just happen. Well, there are some reasons, actually, logical, to do with avoiding other meanings. Again, denial and send receive a word against goes with modal verbs. We've already seen plenty of examples of them. Wouldn't hear a word against. And denial and send receive a word against goes with human subjects. I wouldn't hear a word against. And then with human prepositional objects, I wouldn't hear a word against them. All of that is part of our knowledge of the phrase word against, and it's part of our knowledge of the word word. And it's what we're primed for by recurrent occurrences of this kind of combination. And we notice finally the genre, style, or social situation that it's in. But that doesn't quite exhaust it. We've got also, so there's an example, the denial, send, receive, a word against is all using fairly colloquial English. But we also notice subconsciously textual features. Now this is actually quite a step forward from all the things I've talked about so far. You'll find regularly talked about. Colligation and collocation, semantic association, often known as semantic preference, or sometimes in a slightly different use, semantic prosody. All of these things are in the literature and have been described by a number of linguists. But there are textual features we pick up too, I'm going to argue, when we encounter language. We are primed for other things. So we notice, for example, whether a word is typically cohesive or not. We know when we're reading or listening whether this word or phrase is going to turn up again. In other words, part of our knowledge is whether we need to attend to this or we can now forget about it. Is it occurring as part of a cohesive chain or avoiding such a chain? So in the example we've been looking at of wouldn't say a word against, you won't get examples, and no examples in my data at all, of words subsequently being repeated. You simply don't do that. Here's a little example. You can just tell I was working on this paper until very recently. From my deathbed. Unfortunately for you, I got up. Obama reassures king of strong Syrian stance. This is last Saturday's paper. The United States is, I won't read it all to you, but you can see it refers to President Obama in the first sentence, and then the President and King Abdullah in the second, and then Obama in the third, and then the President. What we first of all pick up is that President occurs 3 times in the course of 3 sentences. Is that an accident? No, it's not. I looked at 66 independent uses of the word president. By independent, I mean they weren't cohesive with each other. And they occurred in 50 randomly chosen texts. When I say, as I say, that they were not cohesive, there might be in a text a reference to President Bush in one place and President Mitterrand in the other. There was no obvious link between the two. So for that purpose, they would count as 2 uses. But if President Bush was repeated several times, it only counted as 1. So it's all very complicated. All I'm trying to say, I did it scientifically rather than carelessly. But I looked at 66 of these. I excluded parenthetical uses, like Alan Moore, President of the Ramblers Association, because the parenthetical use is clearly quite distinct from all other uses of president. And of the 66 independent occurrences, 50, just at almost exactly 3/4, contributed to the cohesion of the text. So president, I'm claiming, is primed for us. We know when we encounter it first, it's likely to occur again. And of the 50 cohesive uses, over half were part of a cohesive chain, and slightly under half were part of a cohesive pair. So, quite a long tendency for it to form chains. I call those its textual collocations. So So now we're noting that whenever we encounter a word, we're noticing its collocations, its semantic associations, its pragmatic associations, its colligation, and its function and cohesion. What kind of use it's likely to be made of. But we also notice whether the lexical item occurs with particular types of cohesion. So, of the 50 cohesive uses of president, exactly half were cohesive by simple repetition. Just under half were cohesive with pronouns, and just under half were cohesive with a name. And for that purpose, I excluded things like president name, which were just treated as repetitions of president. Of course, there's lots more than 100 there, because they can be cohesive in a number of ways. But crucially, notice that, so president has a strong tendency to be cohesive with straight repetition, with a pronoun following, or with a name. Obviously, self-evidently, you can have more than one cohesive relation in a text. So the claim is that we're primed to associate the word president with cohesion by simple repetition, pronouns, and names, co-reference. Okay, take now another word from that same text, frankly. Again, I looked at 50 independent uses of the word frankly in 50 texts. I excluded disjunct uses, the kind of use which says, frankly, that's stupid, or it's a frankly stupid lecture. That kind of use of frankly I excluded, okay? Of the 50 uses, just 5 were part of the cohesion of the text. All 5 were just a single pair, and there were no chains. Only, in fact, 2 repetitions and 1 antonym, one where frankly appears to be being contrasted with fudging, 1 synonym, honestly, and 1 hyponym, which is where it spells out the nature of the frankness. He admitted is the verb that follows. So you could argue that a couple of those are pretty, on the edge of cohesion anyway. So we're primed to associate frankly with non-avoidance of cohesion. So what I'm suggesting here is that as we read, or listen actually as well, we're not only primed for the expected things, collocations, semantic associations and so on, but we're also primed for the cohesive relationships. And there's no difference, in principle, between being primed by a single text and primed on many occasions by different texts. Last night, Sue will be shocked to hear this, at 11:30 at night after she fell asleep, I reread the paper I wrote for Michael Lewis's volume in 2000. And I discovered that I was saying that then, so it proves I'm saying nothing new really. I was saying that actually, just reading a text, you get lots of experiences of those words that are repeated. You're getting lots of different experiences of that word in the text. We also notice whether it's associated with a particular textual relationship, its semantic associations in the text. So we notice, in other words, whether there's a specific semantic relationship or pragmatic relationship it's associated with. The claim is that every lexical item, word or phrase or whatever, may be positively or negatively primed to occur with things like contrast or comparison or time sequence or a problem solution pattern. They can be textual, which is the, if you like, the semantic aspect, or they can be pragmatic. They can do with the relationship between two people. Michael McCarthy once pointed out to me that in conversation, you never start your turn with the word the. So the avoids an initial position because it's you always say things like, I think that, or I suppose that, or well that. So denial and centracy of the word against is used in a context where people have just been or are about to be criticised. It's fairly obvious, really, but that's nevertheless its textual semantic relationship. Another thing that McCarthy noted is that got is associated with problem elements, problem solution patterns. And notice that's quite a long time ago, 15 years ago. Susan Hunston, again 12 years ago, noted that may not be is associated with contrast. I looked at the word 60, which is a word you wouldn't imagine would have any relationship with anything in that sense, but of 100 randomly chosen independent examples of 60 in my data, the reason I'm only working with 100 or 50 is because you have to read the whole text, or the immediate, in this case, the whole paragraph. But in the case of cohesion, I was having to read the whole text, and reading 50 texts is probably the reason why I had the heart attack. Tedious stuff. However, 100 randomly chosen examples of 60, 41 occurred in a contrast relation. 37 occurred as the problem components for problem solution pattern, and 16 occurred in a non-contrastive comparison, which left only 20 of 21 instances that weren't accounted for. Again, like with cohesion, they add up to more than 100 because it's possible to be in more than one relationship. Again, looking at a go, same sort of story, 55 of 100 instances occurred in a contrast, and a further 16 in another kind of comparison. So the texts, as we said, I was saying a few minutes ago, texts prime our vocabulary for us, and in turn, our vocabulary primes us with regard to the organisation of those texts. And then there's the third of the features, the textual claims, which is that, and I've done a lot of work on this, and here I have to acknowledge my work with Matt Brooke O'Donnell, Michelle Malberg, and Mike Scott. We ran a project demonstrating this, and oddly enough, therefore, I'm going to talk least about it, because I've written about it in a number of places. But words associate with particular positions in a text, spoken or written. That example I gave of the before, that White McCarthy's, is actually an example of this. So, what we're not talking about is occurring in a special position, like the beginning of a sentence or the beginning of a paragraph. So, denial, send, receive a word against, wouldn't say a word against her, is typically used at the end of a sentence, 80% of cases. It was announced yesterday in newspaper texts, and of course all these things, remember there are lots of different overlapping languages, newspaper language being one of them. It was announced yesterday, is typically used at the end of the first sentence of a newspaper text. So first, two things, it's at the end of the sentence, and it's the first sentence. And so very, very precise kind of positionings. So to arrive at where we've got to, take the phrase according to her. According to, first of all, according collocates with to and her. It has a semantic association with research sources, so you can have according to a study, according to a poll, according to a report. It has a research, according to a research source, has a pragmatic association with some bad news. It has the colligational effect of being very frequently followed by a which, according to a research study which shows that sugar is bad for you. It's usually repeated not by itself, but by a paraphrase, like said or told. The poll showed that, the key researcher said, and so on. It has a semantic association of being part of a claim-evidence relationship, and it's very strongly associated with the first sentence of the news story and the second half of the sentence. And that is what you need to know about the word according. That's what a native speaker, in a sense, knows about the phrase according to. And of course, it's different in other contexts. This is just newspaper English. If it had been other kinds of English, it would have been another set of statements one would be making. claim that lexical priming theory can take account of and explain psycholinguistically collocation, semantic association, the whole list of things we've been talking about. So what's the significance for the language learner? Well, first of all, I've just noticed the water. I was thinking to myself, it would be nice to have some water. Actually, from what I was saying earlier, you probably know that the real truth is it would be nice to have some beer, but IATEFL's so cheapskate. It's one of the great things, by the way, in all the things I'm no longer allowed to do, wasn't allowed to do before because I'm making a habit of what I'm having, but one of the things I am able to have is alcohol, because it thins the blood. Every pint's good for me. So, the liver may be in trouble, but the existence and ubiquity of all of these things that I've been talking about absolutely must be seen as completely supporting Michael Lewis's view of the centrality of lexis. Everything that he was saying in the Lexical Approach book is wholly backed up by all of this corpus linguistic and psycholinguistic research. It simply must be what he says is true. If you want to argue it's not, you're going to have to argue against all the different sets of research. And one or one more of them may be wrong. It may prove wrong that textual semantic association is something that we're primed for, because we haven't got enough evidence on that yet. But some of the others, like collocation and colligation, and the last one I was mentioning about positioning, the evidence is so overwhelming, we can't throw it away. So it has to be the case that the lexical approach is right in what it's claiming. And again, all those textual features I was picking up on are absolutely central to Stephen Krashen's claim. You couldn't possibly ever expect to teach or learn consciously as part of your monitor all the textual properties of every word in the text. But it is the case, I would claim, by the very fact that we reproduce these things when we write and we speak, that we do indeed acquire these things as a result of frequent encounters. So his notion that we should be exposed to naturally occurring data that interests the learner and slightly extends them has got to be right. And interestingly, the reason why I can write a Chinese speech but can't speak is because I have very little opportunity to talk in Chinese, but I can read. And so I spend about 45 minutes a day working on my Chinese, including attempts to read. Very poor, don't speak it well. But I am nevertheless learning that way. How else could the textual features of lexis be acquired, even by a native speaker, if it weren't a result of encounters subconsciously with lots of data that extend you? So, if you accept my theory, which of course you may not, but if you do accept my theory, then the lexical approach and the monitor model are indeed supported. They are at least supported by one worked out linguistic theory. So they don't need to do that work. So let's look at the third one. The features of language the lexical approach uses are as present in Chinese as in English. And I'm saying that you could argue it's only been used for Indo-European languages. And this I'm going to be brief on because my time is running out, and also because you don't need it as much. But I think it's interesting for all that. First of all, English and Chinese are usually talked about as two languages that are very different from each other. There's a fairly clear difference between words and morphemes in English, and there's a very, very fuzzy boundary between words and morphemes in Chinese. Intonation is, of course, a discourse feature in English, whereas tone is the feature of crucial to Chinese. And finally, time and number are marked grammatically in English and marked characteristically so at any rate, and they're marked lexically in Chinese. So let's look at these claims. I'm only going to look at the first cluster. I'm not going to look at the textual ones. The words are characteristically the collocations. Is this true of Chinese? Well, first of all, it's already been shown that it is actually. Richard Shao and Tony McHenry have demonstrated the existence of collocation in Chinese, so I'm really just illustrating something that's already been demonstrated. But here are some examples. Lan Hao Ren, Hao Shan, Heng Hao, Hao Bu Hao, Hao Feng Jing, Hao Qi, Hao Wan, and then all the Chinese in the room now know I can't speak Chinese. But you'll see, all of these, Hao means good, basically. And they all have different uses. So, Lan Ra Hao Ren is someone who tries to be on good terms with everybody. Hao Feng Jing is beautiful scenery. Hao Wan is amusing, interesting. So those are collocations of Hao. So collocation exists. It's, in fact, everywhere in Chinese. It seems even more pervasive, probably because I'm a learner, than it is in English. Collocations. How about Chinese? Well, I looked at Hoey, because it sounds like Hoey. Hoey, Michael Hoey. And regret and repenting is what you're all doing for having been here. In 75 instances of Hoey, there was an exact split between positive and negative. Half of them are negative, half are positive. But actually, that's a priming, a very strong priming for negativity. Michael Halliday demonstrated 20 years ago that there was the ratio of positive to negative in the language is 9 positives to 1 negative. So we might want to allow for differences between Chinese and English in this, but all the evidence suggests that Hoey is associated with negative polarity. And here I need to owe my debt to Xiao Zhuan, who was one of my PhD students, who did, on this slide and a later slide, did the research for me. She did the analysis, I merely admired. So then, the next one is semantic associations. How about that for Chinese? Well, Hoey has a semantic association with an unhappy action taken or a happy action not taken. This is my own analysis, but it's not difficult to see that if you have a word that means repent or regret, it's likely to do that, but so it does. So in each of these cases, we've got I regret making a mistake, committing an error, not going, listening to his or her words, and so on. And a pragmatic association one, it has this is another of Xiao Zhuan's pieces of work. Interestingly, of the 38 negative examples, 12 of them were used to make a suggestion. Now, obviously, we need more data. Getting a Chinese corpus to work for this is not actually that easy. But a third of them were making a suggestion. And that is a quite high, even allowing for the cultural differences between China and the UK, where it is more acceptable to make a suggestion in China than in the UK. Nevertheless, that seems a high proportion of suggestions. So it has a pragmatic association with suggestion. And none of the positive forms make a suggestion, it's only the negative forms. So, the features of language the lexical approach makes are indeed as present in Chinese, at least of those first 4, as they are in English, on the basis of limited analysis, but nevertheless all support pointing in the right direction. What's the significance of all this? Well, if languages as apparently different as English and Chinese operate according to the same lexical principles, even though they differ culturally, phonologically, and grammatically, then it would be sensible for our language learning processes to be based upon the common ground between languages rather than the differences. So back to Lewis and Krashen. They said that Michael Lewis had been criticised for these things falsely. Lewis sees grammar as an output of lexis, and that's supported by the evidence. Not open to criticism of only applying to Indo-European languages. It does apply outside that. And likewise, it follows the model is quite safe to use. I'm very honoured to have Michael Lewis in the audience at the moment, but his model is wholly safe to use. He'll be relieved to know. And the same goes for Stephen Krashen. Despite the opprobrium with which he is sometimes referred, the reality is that all of those things he's been criticised for are false criticisms. What he does is correctly recognise the ancillary nature of grammar. Languages are not grammars into which we insert vocabulary. They are lexicons which we help shape with a minimum and constantly flexible and changing grammar. And he doesn't trivialise the role of the teacher. He simply says the teacher has a new kind of role. And his model, likewise, is safe to use. One of the interesting things is that when I was preparing this paper, I went back and reread the Lexical Approach, which I hadn't read since it came out. I read it at the time, but I hadn't read it since. And I didn't remember how importantly Stephen Krashen's work is referenced in that book. The two researchers and applied linguists coming up with very, very compatible positions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Michael, for a fascinating lecture, and I'm very pleased that you made it, and I'm sure everybody else in the audience is very pleased that Michael made it this morning, despite...
I'm pleased I made it.
One thing just to say, though, that Michael won't be doing his follow-up session this afternoon at 15:35. We're very pleased for him to have come here and done an excellent job of opening today, and let's put our hands together